Welcome to episode 308 of This Is Whole Life. We are sans the Sincabani, which I'm not really sure where he is. He flying? Is today a flying day, or is he
He's probably
there?
over the Atlantic at this point.
His nose is probably in that book that I gave him last week.
I bet it is.
I went directly, I'll have you know, after the podcast taping, went to Amazon, and it wasn't going to get here in time, so I thought, how about the old Barnes & Noble, right? They still sell books, don't they?
Yeah.
They do. They had what I was looking for, that Walking Drum by Louis L'Amour. And Jeff was, as you heard last week, he was a little annoyed with Ken and I. But
he was. I wish you could have been in here in the studio because it was really, you couldn't probably hear it in his voice, but
the eye
rolls and the inaudible sighs. And
we're moving on, right?
I'm sure Jeff isn't listening to this, right?
No, he probably won't. But he might when he gets back.
Yeah,
after.
there we go.
And then he came up to me on Saturday. He's like, that book you got. He's like, it wasn't a Western. I'm like, I know you were so disgusted with us. You weren't listening to us tell you that it wasn't a Western, that you might actually enjoy it because it's 12th century.
Yeah.
I mean, it's fiction, but anyway, he started the book.
Research.
He started just a little bit. He cheated. So I'm thinking he was wanting a head start for that trip.
He wanted to see whether it was worth the luggage space, probably.
Yeah. I mean, 430 pages. It's not just it's not a breeze through.
No, you don't.
No. And it turns out 10 other of you also used that link to check out.
Apparently, it was the most used link of all, right? Is that what you told me?
I looked at it today because I just wanted to be fair to make sure that there was, I wasn't giving preferential treatment, or I wasn't making stuff up. But actually, there were 3 books that all finished with 10, and those were The Rest of God by Mark Buchanan. That was recommended. And then The Sabbath, Abraham Joshua Heschel, had 8. And Subversive Sabbath, The Surprising Power of Rest in a Nonstop World by A.J. Swoboda, had 9.
Oh, nice.
So, everyone went.
It's well distributed.
It was.
Hey, thank you guys for listening, and thank you for checking out those links. And I think I would love to hear back from anybody on what their experience was with those books.
With any of them. Yeah, did you order, or did you just check it out?
Yeah, and if you ordered one and you read it, I'd love to hear a review. What did you think? Good recommendation? Not good recommendation?
Should have just kept it
to ourselves. To know. People can call in, right? They can call and leave a voicemail and tell us. Ooh, that would be kind of fun to hear what they thought of those books.
Yeah, give us like a 90-second or less review on the book if you actually got one and you read it, or you're in the process of reading it and you're excited and you're plowing through it already. And the other part was, a ton of people did actually go through and look at the books, and the shares, again, I noticed a huge jump in there's a link that goes into all this stuff on Twitter, and that link jumped by about 30 shares this past time. So you guys are sharing again. Thank you very much.
Awesome. We appreciate that.
And we love that. And the books this time, I got smart. I can't just put it you can't always count on people to grab the show notes because you kind of forget. So I put the books all in a tweet.
Nice.
So that probably did help. So in the future, I will start doing that as well. If we're going to...
Can we still use Twitter? Is that still... Will we be able to do that?
Last time I checked, it was still up.
Is it?
Yeah, it was still up and doing well.
Just want to sure now that Musk owns it, whether if that changes anything.
There was a lot of people hand-wringing, but so far so good. So stick with us, people.
Well, actually, it should add more people, right? Because that was his whole thing with it, that he thinks less restrictive, but I think also more features. Like, can we just get an edit your tweet, please? Oh, yeah.
Could we please? Like every other platform, it's like after you do it and it's like you totally spelled the word wrong or whatever, and it's like, oh, man, do I have to delete it? People have already commented on it. Now they're laughing at me because I can't spell. And no, I really do know how to spell. But yeah, no. So I'm hoping that's high on his list. I've already DM'd him about it. So
let's see if that was worth $40 billion to be able to put the edit.
I'm hoping because that would make my life better. I use Twitter a lot, so that'd be great for me. All right, this week I'm wondering, and I just had to ask Ken before we start anything, are you sure that the title of this past week's message didn't accidentally get changed from its original title?
Boy, you're making me feel a little nervous now. I don't know. Did it?
Well, I mean, I heard the title was 4 Ways to Kill.
Yeah.
But I was pretty sure. I mean, I looked it up online.
Should have been 4 Ways to Murder.
1,000 Ways to Kill, A Tale of the Velvet Sledgehammer? No, that wasn't.
No, that was not the original. It was not the original, no.
And this wasn't so much. This was like the double-sided. If you've ever seen a sledgehammer, there is a sledgehammer, and then sometimes the other side will have
like a pickaxe or something.
Pickaxe or an angle on it for doing something. This was the double-sided flat sledgehammer, because if you think about it, It was pretty rough when you think about like the 4 stories.
Yeah.
Were Sparkle we were in the back.
Yeah.
And she's like,
is she okay?
She is, but she was like, is this person coming here next? About the shooting.
Oh no.
In Guam. And we're like, no. This is a story. No. This is a story. She's like, oh. But then you can catch her like looking around like, baby, no, nobody's coming here. This is a story. This happened before. And she's very, very literal person.
Yeah,
and she does listen. And so she's always checking out. And then when church was over, obviously nothing bad happened. So it was all good. But if you didn't catch the message, this is one that you definitely should listen to because...
And perhaps maybe just put a trigger warning on that. If you have children, you may want to...
This was not intended for small children.
You may not, I don't know. You may want to listen to it first and then decide what level of you're up to. And that's I felt a little bad. I wish I had kind of said that ahead of this sermon. It's like, hey, there's going to be some stories in here that maybe with small children you might want to, just... You'd have to decide on what your level is with those. I know that one of the things that I struggle with is that being a former news broadcaster, my filter on that to me was a very G-rated renditions of those stories. And I recognize for other people that's very much not the case. And for those, if I offended you or if I scarred your child for life, please, let me know. Come find me, and I will apologize to you personally and to your child as well. I feel like the stories were worthwhile. They were on topic. Absolutely. And I think that all that, but at the same time, I also recognize I had thought about, that, and I had tried to keep it. But like I said, my news filter is like, this is pretty tame for what I used to read on the news. But this isn't the news. This is up front in a big church. So,
but I think the stories though, the realness and the authenticity that, because they were your stories, these were events that you lived through.
Sure.
The car one, I'm like, well, he's here, so obviously
he survived.
He survived, but I wasn't so sure there for a while.
Yeah, I wasn't so sure either in that story.
And at the end, I'm just like, the message to me, maybe it was a little raw, but I think those are the kinds of raw moments that we need in church that just say, life isn't always like, well, Jesus loves me. Yes, that's true. Jesus saves me. Yes, that's true. And we get a little kumbaya sometimes. Then every once in a while, a little bit of, oh man, life is dirty and nasty sometimes, and it's a little rough. And not that you want to do it for just shock value, no. But when you really see, there was emotion as you kind of went back telling those stories, and we were at second. And so even for there to have been, telling in the first service and at the second, and there was clear emotion there, those pull on the heartstrings in a way that make you think that you don't think at that same level if you don't actually hear it, or that the person telling the story doesn't mean anything to you.
Well, so I guess I could say I'm an old newscaster, but I've been reading the Bible since I was pretty young, and the Bible has some pretty crazy stories in there. So anyway, sure. But with all that being said, I was thinking about this, Randy, and in the sermon, for those of you who may not have heard it, but those of you who heard it, you know exactly what happened. I basically said, I'm going to tell you stories. I'm going to tell you 4, and then I want you to go home and discuss it. I'm not going to tell you what I think they mean. And I got to thinking about it. I thought, Jesus' disciples would pull him aside after these things and say to them, well, what did you mean by that?
Let us in.
And I feel like this is the podcast. Maybe the podcast crew would like to hear what my thoughts are on those stories. What do you think?
That's what I was hoping, because you did say, the rabbis weren't into always answering your questions, and that we've kind of gotten into that in our society. Teachers, we test, we want answers, and then as long as you give the right answer, you're okay. And I was wondering, even if, and maybe you have another story that you wanted to share just with the podcast, because I feel like if there was 4, there must be
a 5th, right? There must be a 5th. It's funny thing is, I actually had thought of a 5th, and now I'm like going through my memory bank. I was like, what was the 5th one that I was thinking about doing?
So I was going to ask if there was a 5th, and then what were your thoughts on each of those? Because I kind of wrote down some ideas about maybe what they didn't have in common, what they had in common, maybe some insights. So I was curious to hear if you would be willing to, or if we were just going to keep the kind of the
No, I think that what my goal out of that sermon, by the way, is not that so much that I don't want to share what my opinion was, as much as I want. A lot of times, if I share my opinion, you stop thinking. as soon as I say, this is what this means and this is what I think about that, you're like, oh, okay, yeah, that's it. And what I really think is that what's always surprised me is I've shared stories with people and said, well, what do you think about that? And I listened to their discussion. I'm like, I didn't mean that, but that's so much better than what I thought. I mean, and so in some ways I'm a little bit worried. I'm not like Jesus where I have the ultimate story, right? And so I'm a little bit almost worried when I share what some of these stories mean to me. You'll be like, wow, we got something so much deeper than what you, or whatever, than what you're going to say. But yeah, maybe I should share the 4 stories for people, or you just want to tell them to go back and watch the sermon, or what do you want to do?
Yeah, let's do that. Just go back, and if you haven't heard it yet, you can go to Speaking of Grace. It's already up. It's already ready. The message is there. One of the Q&As is attached to it, and you'll hear the four stories. There was. Should we just? There were
there's the shooting at the Adventist clinic on Guam. That was the first one.
Then there was Opie. And there was the Value Genesis and Stoplights. The 4. So
4 stories.
Those are 4 good stories.
Yeah.
I hope just by that's enough. Go back and listen to them. Even if you have to press pause now, go back and listen to that part of the message, and then come back and then let's continue.
Okay, because that'll save time.
Yeah, we're back from pause. Go for it.
Cool. All right. So the first story was pretty straightforward, right?
Yep.
We were talking about the 6th commandment, thou shalt not murder. And in the first story, I talk about basically a murder that took place on Guam. A man that came in and killed 2 people, wounded several others. Eventually was killed himself. And there's a couple layers to that I wanted people to think about. So firstly, it is a very straightforward case of murder. This is a man who went in and unnecessarily took the life of several people. And what I think is really important in that story is that he didn't just he took lives, but he also he physically took lives, but he also emotionally took some lives. There are a number of people that were very scarred and very damaged emotionally from what this man did. It changed the trajectory of some of their lives.
It had to.
It did.
Yeah.
And so, so that I think that's there's that aspect of it. So obviously, this man murdered people. But what I thought was also another important thing to think about was that the SWAT team came in and killed him. So the question is, did they murder him or did they kill him? Were they justified in doing what they did, or were they not? Now, can be a lot of nuance to it. The question is, did they try to talk him out of that room? Did they try to talk him out but believe that he was going to kill the hostage that he had? Before maybe he killed himself.
He still had the hostage.
He had a hostage in that room. So when the SWAT team went in, were they justified in doing what they were doing? And that's the question that we often encounter. And that's one of the problems when we interpret the Bible as thou shalt not kill, and it excludes all killing whatsoever, is then a police officer in this situation, let's just say this particular situation where there's somebody who's already murdered several people and is holding a hostage, is a police officer justified in taking this life if the commandment says thou shalt not kill? And so that's where, in my reading of the Bible, it's very plain that the police officer is justified in doing that. And we are grateful for the law enforcement that fairly and justly apply the law and are very conscientious. But that's the other part that I think that as a law enforcement person you have to think about a little bit as well, is that you have to really think. I mean, when you have when you're sanctioned by the government with the ability to take life, you have to take that seriously. And the police officers I've known do.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that there aren't police officers out there that are otherwise, but what I am saying is I think most police officers take that pretty seriously. And at WholeLife, we have a police officer in our church every Saturday. They're with us, and I'm really grateful to them for being there because it provides a level of safety at our church that I think is important. And I'm grateful for their service. And so I think that's something to think about. On the other side, I think that one of the things people have to think about is we have a number of people that join the military.
Yeah, I was just going to say military is another.
And traditionally, Seventh-day Adventists have discouraged our young people from joining the military because of the sixth commandment, and also because of the fifth commandment often, and as well being able to keep the Sabbath.
Yep.
Those two commandments, thou shalt not kill or murder, and remember the Sabbath day, are usually the two reasons why the Seventh-day Adventist Church has traditionally encouraged its people to not necessarily join the military. Now that trend has kind of changed in recent years, but I know when I was growing up, you were really discouraged from joining the military for those kind of reasons. And Adventists have a history of being pacifist. Probably best exemplified by Desmond Doss during World War II, conscientious objector, although he liked to be called a conscientious cooperator, who refused to bear arms but was a medic and was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. So that's kind of the background of it. But I think that one of the more overlooked things when it comes to military service is this: when we take into account the commandment "Thou shalt not murder," there are justified wars according to the Bible. We see them in the Bible. We see God telling His people to go to war. The problem is that there's also unjustified wars, and what we've seen in places is that when you're in the military, whether it's the United States military, the German military, whatever country's military you're in, what happens when you go to war and it's not justified? What do you do in that situation? Because when you're in the military, you no longer belong to yourself. You follow orders, or else there's court-martials and other things to happen. Yeah. And so that's one of the things I think that people have to also kind of keep in mind is that there are wars that are absolutely justified where we're doing the right thing, but there's other times where countries go to war for reasons that are not justified. And if you don't believe that, then all you have to do is go back to World War II and look at what happened with Germany. There were a lot of quote-unquote good Christians that were in the German army, following the bidding of a truly evil man. And so I think we have to think about those things as we contemplate what we're going to do. If we are going to be in the military, do we have the strength and the courage to say, no, this isn't the right thing to do, and I'm willing to take the consequences if it violates my conscience on what I think ought to be happening? So those are things I think people ought to think about a little bit. And sometimes we just overly simplify the commandment by saying, well, don't join the military because it says thou shalt not kill. Well, the Bible is pretty clear that there are times where that's justified, and not only justified, but necessary and important. I mean, we can all be grateful that there's a military that protects our freedom here in the United States.
Absolutely.
We should absolutely be grateful for that. And I'm grateful to the men and women in the service who protect my freedom. And I would like to think that were I needed to do that, I would stand up and take my place to protect the freedoms that Americans have, if that were needed and necessary. So, but I also would want to think that if I knew that my country was doing something that was unjust and we were murdering rather than protecting life, that I would say, no, I can't do that. But that's a tough spot to be in. It's a very tough spot to be in. So that's something for people to think about on that. So that's a long discussion of that first story.
But you're right, though, to not include the nuances of even the fourth and the sixth commandment, and just say, well, if you kill, you kill. There's no nuance to this. There's no second guessing. There's no right, wrong, or things that need to happen. And the Sabbath, that it's black and white. Yeah. And even though that really there are some instructions in there, but I wouldn't say they're all black and white either. There's nuances, and
there is.
I think we're way more balanced. It's just harder. I think you're right, though. It's way harder once you get into that situation and go, oh man. I mean, like when I enlisted, this was not the case, and now whatever's happening, and now, we're like if you were in the Russian army, and all of a sudden it's like, hey, we're going to Ukraine, and I'm not really sure this is what I really want to be doing, or that this was the right thing to do. And they even had, according to some reports, people, everyday citizens from Russia were just like, hey, here's a gun, go fight, and going to the other side like, yo, I'm out, just send me wherever. And I think you get caught in those places. But the nuance I think is important to think about. Yeah.
Life is about nuance, and sometimes we try to make things a lot easier or black and white than they really are. So that would be the first story that those are some thoughts I had. I'm sure some of you had better thoughts than I do on that one. So, so that's the first story. The second story was about Opie.
Yeah.
And I think that one was a pretty straightforward story when it comes to understanding something that just because in this particular story, Opie was a classmate of mine in high school, who eventually he was there my freshman year. And none of us could remember his name because we just called him Opie. That wasn't his real name, but we called him Opie and severely bullied him. And he left after his freshman year, and then a couple years later, we had heard that he took his own life. And I think the thing that really hit me on that was that, I could have stepped up and said something. I wasn't one of the ones that was like, physically bullying, because I probably wasn't really particularly capable of that part of it. But I never ever stepped up and said, hey, cut that out. Hey, that's not right. Don't do that. Yeah. And it's something I've tried to train my children to do better than I did. And my problem is that there's a lot of times, they say, sticks and stones will break your bones, but words will never hurt me. And that's just, I think all of us know that's not true.
A defense mechanism.
Words absolutely hurt you. And just because I think one of the things in Christendom that we're very hard on is when people take their lives. And there's, I think that I've seen families that I've had to work with that have been incredibly wounded when they have somebody they love that takes their life, and there's not a lot of support around them. It's like, oh, your loved one has done something that God can never forgive them for, or whatever, and because that was their last act. And I think that sometimes it's easy in that particular situation to put the blame on the person and not see some of the circumstances that could lead a person to be in such a dark place. And in the particular case of Opie, I have to take responsibility for the fact that I could have done better. If I don't, could I have prevented it from happening? Nobody will ever know that. But I know I could have done better.
Sure. Yeah.
I could have done better. I could have stood up for him. I could have stood alongside him. I could have told people to leave him alone. I could have been his friend.
Yeah.
And I didn't. I didn't choose to do that. And that's something that I'm grateful for God's grace that I pray for, but it's also something I'm very cognizant of now that I could have done better and I should do better. And one of the things that I need to do is make people aware that they too can do better. Talking to my kids about trying to be kind to people.
Yeah.
And at that age, kids are like, kids will be kids. And in your teenage years, it's a rough time, but that's not an excuse. It's just one of the things where we say, hey, let's do better. Let's do better. And so for me, when I look at that particular story, I'm making the point that you don't have to be the person that picks up a gun or a knife to kill somebody. Sometimes your words can push people off of ledges, particularly when they are in a vulnerable place in life. And so we have to be careful about the words we use. Not just be careful not to, it'd be easy to say, I could say, well, I called him Opie, but that was it.
Yeah. That wasn't that bad.
That wasn't that bad.
Yeah.
Well, the question is, but did I do the most that I could, or did I just look the other way and ignore something that needed to not be ignored? And the point I'd like people to make is that you can, what if Opie hadn't taken his own life, but he'd just lived a life of depression? Does it make it better? I would far prefer him to be alive. I would, because hopefully you could work through the depression. But if he's living a life that's miserable and I'm not doing anything to help, I'm taking away from his quality of life, especially when I'm participating by calling him, Opie, which was not, in term of endearment, really.
Well, and we all have our Opies. Yeah. And that maybe was the saddest story of all of them. Active shooter situation is, there was a lot of loss of life, which is obviously very sad, but I think we don't all resonate unless you have that. But Opie, immediately, it's like everyone got uncomfortable in the room.
Yeah.
In between services, we were upstairs, the AV team, getting some refreshments and just kind of discussing, like, whew, man, that was a little bit. And everyone was like, who was your Opie? And there was nobody that didn't have a name, that couldn't find someone. Yeah. And whether it was even just inaction, I saw it happening, I did nothing. I didn't even call the person Opie, but I didn't do anything.
Yeah.
And so the inaction part being this like killing someone with inaction is even, and then the loss of life. Most of us probably know someone that we've lost to that. So they're taking their own life, and that's just heartbreaking on every level. That was, and just the thought of them being almost invisible, even though they take all the abuse, it's almost like they're invisible, and you're like, how in the world could this happen?
Yeah.
But yet it's so easy to just like, it's just Opie. It's fun. It's okay.
He doesn't mind.
No.
He really doesn't mind. I mean, he's laughing with me, right? I mean,
I'm sure
I think that's the hardest thing about bullying, because people will go up to the person being bullied and go, "You okay with that?" And they'll be like, "Oh yeah, I'm fine." Yeah. But you know what? The good litmus test is if you have to ask if they're okay, they're probably not.
Yeah.
And you can't expect somebody. That's one of the things that bullied children get told all the time is just don't ignore it. Don't do anything to encourage the person to keep doing it. Since Opie, I've actually gone back to other people. Actually, it was much later after Opie, because it took me a while to mature, and I maybe still am. But there's been people I've gone back to in my life and said, "Hey, I was not good to you. I'm really sorry."
Yeah.
Particularly as I've watched my children go through some rough experience. I think that was probably what
the catalyst.
What really hit for me is watching my children and thinking I could have been. I know I was the kid that did that to my kid, and I called up a couple of those people in my life and said, "Hey, I'm really sorry, and I hope you can forgive me." And so there was some good conversations that were had there. But I think we all probably do have an Opie in our life. We have somebody that either now or later. And by the way, if you're an adult right now, you think, "Thank goodness I'm not a teenager or child anymore doing that." If you've got your own children, I'd encourage you to be honest with them about the Opies in your life, the regrets that you have with the way that you treated people. There's nothing more powerful to your child than you admitting things and just saying, "Hey, I could have been done better." And it's a catalyst for them to go, "Hey, Dad, Mom, they've been there and they regretted it, and maybe I need to do better." So, if you weren't able to do better with your own life, maybe you can do better with your grandchildren or your children by just telling them the truth about the things that you wish you'd done differently.
Yeah, good point. Value Genesis.
Yeah, that was a rough story, huh? That one was in that particular story. Basically, myself and several of my friends, when we were teenagers, got up in front of a church to talk about a study that had been done and just got torn apart by some of the older people in the church. And with that story, one of the things that I wanted to point out is that we can spiritually murder people.
Oh, absolutely.
And by the way that we behave in church, and it's not just even our teens. There are people that are invisible at church that we ignore, that we don't socialize with, talk about, and we can spiritually murder people to the point where they don't want anything to do with God because of how mean His followers are.
Yes.
And so, that was the point that I probably would have driven home, is that we need to be careful how we behave, particularly when it comes to church, because we don't want to do things to alienate. It's one of the things as I get a little bit older and I try to be better, and I hope I continue to get better. But I've learned that sometimes it's not about being right at church, on the right side of the argument. Sometimes if I've offended somebody, even though I know I'm right, maybe the best thing for me to do is to particularly as a senior pastor, but as a pastor, sometimes the best thing I can do is listen and say, "I'm really sorry I hurt you."
Yeah.
I don't necessarily have to say I was wrong, but I'm sorry I hurt you, because I am. If I hurt somebody, I'm sorry I hurt them.
Yeah.
I don't, and maybe there is a better way to do things than the way that I did them. But I think that, humility comes along and says, "Let me listen to your story." I don't need to be walked over. And if I'm right, then I don't need to, if I'm doing the right thing that needs to be done, then it needs to be done. But I can do it in a way that's loving and kind and grace-filled, as opposed to, ha, 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 I'm right, you're wrong, just live with it kind of thing. So that would be that story. So,
well, and I think a lot of us, if you have some type of, if you've been a Jesus follower for a while and you've been baptized and you've been, living your life as someone who loves Jesus, then you are a pastor. You are a leader of people. And so, sometimes I think it's like, well, we expect more from the pastor because he's up front. And, I mean, he wears a jacket and tie, so he's kind of holy and stuff, right? I mean, he's got stuff pulled together when in fact, I think we underestimate all of us, underestimate our ability to really lead people in the right way or in the best way that we know how or where we are without the hurt part. And then the hurt part, though, can be, and sometimes it's unintentional, but it's still okay to just say, wow, when you see that look in that face, like, oh man, I'm sorry if that, did that hurt you? Was that offensive? I'm sorry. Yeah. And I think maybe now it's less of I want to say it's a little less of weird than it used to be. Maybe that's not the word I'm looking for. And I'm not saying it's all like woke culture, but when you're a little more hypersensitive to what comes out of your mouth, and then you're really focusing more on how other people are perceiving it, when you feel like, maybe just like, hey, if I offended you, and if I did, I'm sorry, and like give them time to answer. Let them say, yeah, you did hurt me, or I don't know. Or, I've gotten...
And better yet, leave the word out if. Just say, I offended you.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Because a lot of times the word will come out after and it'll be like, yeah, you did. Or, I'm not sure how to take what you said. Yeah. And even at that, it's okay it's probably better to just be on the side of, oops, I felt the weirdness. Let's investigate and let's repair if there's been damage. All right. Stoplights. Oh my goodness. This one had us all on the edge of our seats, literally.
Yeah. I won't go through the whole story, but basically the bottom line was I saw a red light. The person I was driving with, who was in the driver's seat, didn't see the red light, and we were in a pretty big accident. Fortunately, nobody was killed. In fact, everybody walked away. Nobody had to go to the hospital, which is just beyond a miracle, because we were doing 45 or 50 and we just completely T-boned that. And it was all because I didn't say anything. And this is probably, out of those 4 stories, this is the one that has preached to me the most in my life ever since, because I have a tendency to not want to point out to people when they're making a mistake. I don't like being a backseat driver. I don't want to say, hey, Randy, I see this happening. Is that a good idea? I just want to be like, hey, Randy's an adult. He knows what he's doing. He knows why he's doing what he's doing. But, the fact of the matter is that just came down to me is that sometimes you can murder somebody by omitting information that they need.
Oh yeah,
to survive. To giving them the information that they need to have the life that they ought to be having. And for me, that's one of the reasons why I think, we live in a society that says you have no right to judge me, you have no right to say this, and mind your own business kind of stuff. And I guess maybe that's not always true. I guess we also are in a place where people are all constantly canceling each other. But the problem with canceling somebody is there's no communication involved in that.
Yeah.
When you cancel somebody, you're not walking alongside them. You're just ignoring them. You're not actually saying, hey, this is a problem. Or how can I help? Riding beside my friend in that vehicle on that day, riding alongside him, I could have said, hey, there's a red light. And he could have said, I don't care. I'm just going to keep going.
Yeah.
And I was in the passenger seat, so I was along for the ride.
Yeah, you were going where he's
going.
And
he would have had the opportunity to know.
Right.
And I know what would have happened if I had said, hey, there's a red light. He would have, oh, wow, I didn't see that. And he would have come to a stop. But because I didn't say anything about that red light, and the sad part for me is he's the one who got the ticket.
Yeah.
He's the one it probably messed his insurance up pretty monumentally.
Yeah.
And ultimately, it was his fault. He was the driver.
Sure, yeah.
But I could have changed it.
Yeah.
All I had to say was, hey, that's a red light. Do you see it?
Can I ask you a question, though?
Yeah, sure.
And this is just, it's probably nonsensical in a way, in that it's hard to describe certain things that happen in your life. But there's a story that I can immediately, as soon as you said this story, I was like, oh no, he's not going to tell him. Right. And there's been times I thought of 2 immediately, and I can't share the stories, but I should have said something very, very clear. And in both instances, one probably wasn't as bad, more of a mental thing than anything else, but the other could have been way worse, and very lucky, just like your story, that it wasn't. And yet it was almost like, I have no idea why I didn't say anything. And I've struggled with that, because you wonder, do I have, like, secretly, do I not like this person, or was I just going like, oh man, I don't want to be that guy. I hate backseat drivers. This wasn't having to do with driving, but second guessing, or was I just afraid they were going to go, why don't you just mind your own business and not worry about what I'm doing? But in both cases, I can't put my finger on why. There was nothing like, oh, I'll show him. I'm not going to say anything, and he'll learn his lesson. And then you'd really feel bad if something bad happened. But what brought you to the point for not saying anything? Because I think that a lot of times there's maybe it's multiple things that we've had happen in the past that all kind of cause that pause, and then it's just like, well, it's too late, and now boom, it happens, and it's so fast, and then we feel guilty, and then we feel all these emotions, and it's crazy.
For me, there's a couple different reasons. I think that I want people to like me. For me, I'm talking about this one for me. For me, the reason I often won't say a red light is I want people to like me, and I feel like if I start saying that, it's going to make them not like me. It's going to be like, oh, there's the guy that's always
knows better
and says this, says that.
Sticks his nose where it don't belong.
And you don't want to be that person either, do you? You don't want to be the person that's always smarter than everybody in the room and telling everybody what they ought to be doing, ought not to be doing. At the same time, my litmus test is, if I love somebody and it was me, would I want them to tell me in a loving way? Yeah. Not in a judgmental way, but in a loving way. It would, hey, watch out about that, And that for me, that particular story for me, I could name you 3 or 4 other stories where it's the same thing, where it's hard to have difficult conversations with people. It's hard to say, hey, coworker, I see you hanging out with somebody who's not your spouse, which is a nice segue into this next week's one on adultery. But I see you hanging out with somebody that's not your spouse, and I'm watching an intimacy develop between the two of you that I'm really worried is going to bite you later, or sooner maybe. But I'm worried about that. I don't know that you should be spending as much time with that person as you are, because I'm afraid it's going to lead you somewhere that's going to be dark in the long run.
Sure.
And so, and we hate to call that out, because then the person's like, what are you talking about? How could you accuse me of that? Don't you know me? I mean, blah, blah. And, I don't want to be your friend if you think that about me. And that we get afraid that that's the conversation, or we get afraid at work when we have a colleague that we see not putting the effort in. And we're like, well, I'm not the boss.
Yeah.
I don't want to say anything to him. And then later on, that person gets fired. And you wonder, well, what if I had talked to that person and said, hey,
I got to pick it up a little bit.
Yeah, I probably need to pick up the pace a little bit. I'm watching this, I know. But you're like, well, it's not my problem. It's, it's their problem. But the question is, if we truly consider everybody to be our neighbor, what would we want done for us? Yeah. And even if the reaction that we get is bad,
it's bad, yeah.
Isn't it the right thing to do and I've had that happen. I've had it happen where I said, hey, stoplight. And I'm like, who are you to tell me that that's a stoplight? You don't know me. And I'm like, okay. And at that point, though, I've called the stoplight.
Yeah.
And I'm going to be nice about it and say, hey, I'm concerned for you. And they're like, hey, there's nothing to concern you. Just mind your own business. Okay.
Fair
You've
enough.
heard me. I've shared with you and I'm not here to judge you or make your life miserable. I'm just here because I love you and care about you.
Yeah.
Sometimes people will respond to that and be like, oh, okay. And then other times they're like, hey, that, I had one relationship where I called a red light early on in the relationship with that person. And it never got better because they were upset about it. But I also watched it. It was a red light.
Yeah.
And it eventually hit them smack in the face.
Yeah. Blind spots are called that for a reason.
Yeah.
Right?
And so that's maybe one of the other things we ought to be aware of when somebody says that they see a stoplight and you don't see it. Might be a good idea to look up from what you're doing.
Yeah, no.
And really take some time to evaluate it.
The best one was my first marriage. Before I got married, multiple people said this isn't a good idea. I'm like, yeah, you just don't know. You don't know all. You don't know all what I know, which is a true statement. They don't, but they also see things that obviously there were blind spots, and it was like, man, that could have saved a whole ton of money and heartache right there. If you're just like, hey, maybe be a little bit more open to, especially when said people are your mom. Sorry, mom. That's just the way it goes.
Stuff like that.
We learn our lessons, but. Thinking about all these things, it was like all of these things mess with your mental health. Like you said, with the shooter, there were people whose trajectories were, how could they not have been changed from being in that situation? Or obviously Opie's was. Mm-hmm. His trajectory definitely changed, and that might not have been the whole of the situation, but probably a piece. And man, the value genesis, I think. If that doesn't wreak havoc on your spiritual psyche at minimum, if not your personal, because it feels like a personal attack.
It was a personal attack. There's no doubt about that.
And then even the stoplights. If you can stop and you can think about times I should have said something, or I did and it wasn't well received, or other times where it was, and then you're wrong and you're like, well, I should have just kept my mouth shut, because now everyone's mad. And who they all mad at? They all mad at me because I opened my fat mouth and I probably should have just said nothing. Yeah. And so we deal with all that. And then, you go through and people say, well, God couldn't save this person, or, he could have intervened and stopped the shooting. He could have, he could have touched Ken's heart more and helped Opie or any of those kids that were in that situation. Or, you can go down and things happen the way they happen. And you said something that said, God can do different things, but no thanks to me. How situations go together. If I don't do anything, it's no thanks to me. And at the end, it just sounds like it's a regret. And then that's something that we're carrying with us. And I'm like, I don't want to have any regrets about just opening my mouth and saying, Ken, man, I'm seeing your choices here, and it just feels like I should say something. And if I'm off base, then I don't know. Those are just the pieces where I don't want to live with regret, but I also don't want to make people feel like, well, who do you think you are? How smart do you think you are? And what do you think you know about me? And I'm almost, after listening to the stories, because they really did have a bite in person, I'm like, maybe it's just best to go, look, if God's telling you something and he's nudging on you where you feel like, I should probably say something, maybe you should just go with it and take the consequences and say, I felt like it was the right thing to do, and if I was wrong, I'm sorry. Like you said, approach it with, hey, I love you. I see this, and
that's one of the things.
Make it as easy as
my
we can
litmus
ourselves.
test is that I don't insert myself with somebody that I don't love.
There you go.
That's for me. In other words, if it's somebody I do not like, and I know you're, somebody's out there's like, oh, you don't love everybody. Yeah. Well, can we just all be honest? There's that person that drives you absolutely nuts, and you just do not particularly care for them. And so for me, if I find that my interaction with them is more of me just wanting to give them a good slap instead of genuinely caring about them, then I try not to do it, because
that's a good one.
When you're not in a relationship with somebody, when somebody views you as being after them, they don't feel safe, nothing you're going to say to them will ever go through. And so there's been a couple circumstances where I actually liked a person and wanted to say something to them, but I was pretty confident that if I said it, they would never receive it that way because they did not feel loved by me, and that was something I was going to have to. So that my option at that point was to work harder on making them feel loved, so that I can get to the point where I can have a gentle conversation, or if I don't think that it's, sometimes there's some people that will just never be your friend. They weren't going to like you just because they're not going to, and that's their choice. In those particular situations, sometimes one of the things I've done is just gone to somebody that I knew that they did get along with and said, hey, I'm concerned for them. I don't feel like they're going to hear this from me. Do you see this too?
Sure.
And sometimes the person will be, oh yeah, I definitely do. Would you feel comfortable having this conversation with them? Because I don't think they're going to hear it coming from me.
Yeah.
I've seen this done pretty effectively with children.
Yeah.
I've done it. There's been, I don't think Kyle and Eric listen to this very often, so I'll just take my chances on this. But there's been times where I've gone to people that I knew that were their friends that they cared about, or that were sometimes older people that were in the mentoring position, said, hey, I don't think if I say this to Eric or if I say this to Kyle, I think they're just going to go, oh, Dad, who are you? You need to know this, or I know you do. And I said, well, can you just kind of have a conversation with them? Because I think they'll hear it differently from you. And that's, I think, sometimes a loving and caring thing to do too, is that if you know that somebody's not going to be able to hear something, they need to hear something, then go find somebody that does love, that they do feel cared about.
I've done that before, and you're right. It either works out really well. At worst, they still don't like you. Yeah. And they're like, why are they butting in? Why did they go to you? They should have come to me.
And be careful about that being gossip, because there's a very fine line on it being gossip, and so you got to be careful with that. And I think sometimes people are way too quick to assume that somebody doesn't like you, and you'd just rather somebody else be the messenger than you. So, be careful with that. But my point still stands, is that, there's time and a place to find somebody that can reach out to that person in a way that may be effective. Yeah. So I really, out of this whole sermon, out of this particular one, it's really easy to look at that sixth commandment and gloss over it really quickly, because I've never, knowingly murdered somebody.
Tony Marino had the best story to tell.
He did. It was
church,
good.
Pre-roll before everything.
That reminds me of what my fifth story would have been then. So that reminds me. But anyway, my point is that we all, according to Jesus, are murderers.
Yep.
We've murdered Christ himself with the actions that we have. And what I wouldn't want somebody to take away from this sermon is to be like, oh, I'm a horrible person. There's no hope for me. I live in regret, and I'm just going to beat myself up endlessly over it. I think it's an unhealthy thing not to feel regret. Sure. Because if you say you have no regrets in your life, I'm pretty sure you haven't done very much deep thinking about what you've done in your life. I have regrets in my life. I have things that if I could go back, I'd do them differently. I would do things differently now. But I also don't beat myself up and think that I can go back, because I can't. I haven't discovered time travel. I haven't found anybody who does. So I know of no way to go back. So all I know is that I regret, and I use that regret to motivate me to do better in the future. I learn from that mistake and say, okay, I regret that. I'm going to do my best to not let that happen again. And sometimes I do let it happen again. But I just keep trying and asking God's Spirit to help me and change me and make me a better person.
Well, what I really like was the opening or the synopsis paragraph that went with this message, and it said, life is God's most precious gift. Anything that takes away life from another person is an act of murder. We are most like Jesus when we preserve, restore, and give life to others. In short, when we love people. See, I like how you brought that back. That was smooth right there. Didn't even see it coming. And that kind of brings us to our Q&A. Nchy, Nchy, asked, why aren't we healing people at church and performing miracles? Thinking about all these bad things that we can do, and maybe in that spirit of the end of that, where we're most like Jesus when we preserve and the restore and give life to others. So is that something that we can still do?
Yeah, that's a good question. If you go to maybe Benny Hinn or a Pentecostal church, sometimes you'll see people having hands laid on them, and you'll hear stories of healings and things like that. And within the Seventh-day Adventist tradition, that isn't something that we've typically done. We believe that the healing ministry of Christ is extended through modern medicine. It's one of the reasons why Seventh-day Adventists have such an extensive healthcare network. Yeah. The health that we provide, we believe that God gives us the ability to use our minds to create healthcare solutions and do that. And so that's part of it. On the other hand, I've also been a part of different moments where I have prayed over church members, prayed for healing, and I'd love to tell you that every time I prayed, I've seen a change, but that's just not the way it's been. But I have seen miracles happen too. I've seen incredible things happen after praying, laying on of hands, and anointing people. I've seen those kind of things happen. So why don't we do that more in an upfront kind of thing? I think that probably because I think that we have to be careful that when firstly, I believe God is able to perform miracles still today. when it's needed. But I think that God doesn't necessarily call us to do that to bring attention to ourselves or to make a big spectacle always. And so that's probably a reason why we don't see that happening within most Seventh-day Adventist churches. And that's why we don't necessarily do it at WholeLife Church. Now, I will say that, there might be a time and a place where somebody is asking needs special prayer and wants that done in front of the church. And who knows, we take everything on a case-by-case basis. But I think that as human knowledge progresses, God's ways also progress with it. And so the things that were done back in Jesus' time were done because that was the way it needed to be done at that time in that place. They didn't have some of the knowledge that we have today. So that would be I guess that would probably be my answer to that question.
And nothing so far. Well, I mean, I wouldn't say that. There are people that, people say, well, my friend used to say, well, Lazarus was brought back from the dead. So was Nikki Sixx.
Okay.
So he's like, it wasn't Jesus doing it, but it was a medical team, and they were, they had pronounced him dead. And that's a reference to a 1980s glam metal band called Motley Crue, whose bass player died famously for about a minute and a half, and they brought him back somehow. And so it always made me, well, yes, it's tongue in cheek, but at the same time,
Nikki Sixx wasn't dead for 4 days, was he?
He wasn't. No, he hadn't started smelling bad. Well, maybe he smelled bad. Who knows? But it wasn't not for the same reasons. But I just think at the same time, there's so many things that God does that we just take for granted because of the time that we live in. Yeah. There's so many shortcuts that we never had before, just because of knowledge being what it is, and they get easily passed by, and you just don't see. And what would it take if someone else was raised from the dead? Would you believe it? Yeah. Would it be David, David Copperfield, or I think it'd be a hard time.
And I'll give a shout out to Advent Health. That's their motto is extending the or I should say their mission, extending the healing ministry of Christ. Yeah. And that's, I think that probably we don't give enough credit when a doctor helps us through cancer, when a doctor catches something ahead of time. When with the modern medicine, we're grateful to the doctor or grateful to the medical team, and we should be.
Sure.
And we should also, and more importantly, be grateful to Christ who put that knowledge in those minds and gave the ability to do those things.
Yeah. All right. One of the whole life reflections, and I'm just going to read you two because they were both very, very good. What do you think is the most common killer? And this I was just thinking about personally. And then how can you help others live abundantly? Because I'm thinking once you figure out maybe what your most common killer is, how do you turn that around and then make that a positive and be able to help others live abundantly? Like just something to think about. Yeah. And always we'd love again, book reviews, what did we say, didn't say, could have said, should have said, 407-965-1607, or email podcast@wholelife.church. And next week, so we're into adultery this week, right? So we're going to 5.
Well, let's be careful how we say that. We will be talking about adultery this coming Sabbath, Saturday. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So just a little warning for everybody out there. We will be talking about adultery. The word adultery will be used, and so will probably the word sex. And I don't know. I haven't finished the sermon just yet, but for those of you who are wondering, you got kids, I'm going to try to keep this one as PG as I can. We're not going to be telling stories about, we may talk about the woman caught in adultery that we find in the book of John. But what I'm really going to be focusing on this next week, and I know this particular topic can feel pretty awkward. What I'm not wanting to focus on so much is all the bad things about adultery, all the different ways you can commit adultery. I'm probably going to do almost the opposite of what I did this Sabbath when it came to telling stories. I'm probably almost the opposite in the sense that I really want to talk about is what the antidote is to that. And how do we live a life of faithfulness?
Nice.
And what is that? How do we do that? How do we live a life of faithfulness and connection? And that's really where I'll probably be driving and talking about how we can be connected to God. So, with all that being, with all that, I think that kids will be fine to be at church. That's my own personal opinion. But if you're worried, then by all means watch the message, and then if you want them to watch it later. But I will say this, and I think this is important for parents to hear. You need to be talking to your kids about sex. And at whatever age you think they're too young, you're probably wrong.
Yeah.
If your children are hanging out with other children,
yep,
you probably need to be talking in some form or fashion about sexual purity and what that means and what that looks like. The biggest problem is that we have that it's an awkward conversation to have, and so we don't like to have it with our kids. And we assume that they're not going to, if we put them in the right school, put them around the right people, that they're not going to hear anything. But my research is that the average age a child is exposed to pornography is 11, and I think it's actually younger than that.
We had an expert at Forest Lake who said 8 to 9.
Yeah.
Depending boys or girls, and if you're not having the conversation.
So if you're not informing them, somebody else is going to, and it's going to be somebody who's not going to give them the good information that you can give them. And so I just encourage you to be having those conversations with your children, whether you feel like the right place is after a sermon at WholeLife, or whether it's somewhere else. And so that's really where the sermon's going to be going this week. When we talk, we're going to talk about that. And we're going to talk about how to not do that. And nice. So that's where we'll be going.
All right. Well, so what about story number 5? Should we just make that a bonus episode and just drop that midweek? Do you have time?
I'll tell you what. I'll tell it to you, and then if you think it's good enough, you want to, then we can. I don't know. It's not really. I don't know that it adds anything to the conversation.
Okay. Well, let's just do it, and then if we need to. So, well, here, hold on. So that's going to do it for this week. And if the story, I guess I'm the arbitrator here. If the story's really good, you're going to see a bonus episode. It'll be our 3rd bonus episode since Ken started. And you'll find that coming out on Wednesday morning. And if not, wasn't that good. All right. Thanks for listening, guys. Have a great week.